Welcome, church family. It's Friday night to be specific. I'm excited to be with you all, and it's going to be a really cool night tonight. My name is Richard Buckner. I am one of the evangelists of the Greater Philadelphia Church of Christ. If you're visiting with us, you've joined our session and lecture series here for the night, and thank you for being here. This ministry specifically is called the Impact Ministry. We are comprised of just single Christians and different walks of life, and if you want to know more about that, you can check on the description below, or ask more in the chat, and then people will be able to communicate with you. If it is your first time, please put first time in the chat. We want to talk with you. We want to connect with you. And so make sure that we know who you are so we can greet you. And those who are members, welcome, and make sure you're communicating in the chat, saying hi, saying what's up. Throughout the lesson, make sure to put your questions in there. I can always go back because it's going to be kind of played with the live stream. So I can go back and look at the questions and look at just the feedback that everyone's getting. And if you have any questions, maybe someone in the chat will be able to get back to you as well. We'll have some people moderating the chat, and so they'll be able to contact and reach out to you as well. So anything, just put it in the chat. And again, make sure we're greeting one another. I would love for the chat to be alive tonight. And what I mean by that is that there's feedback and encouragement, not necessarily towards me, but towards each other, and affirming answers or asking questions, but having some engagement. I know YouTube can be a little limiting of our engagement versus a Zoom or a Google Meet. But we can still connect, and we have a chat. So let's use it. Let's use it tonight. So we have a lot of great stuff that's going to be going on tonight that I am personally excited about. Like I said, this is our lecture series. This is class 2 of 4. And we are going to be going through the parables of Jesus once again. And now specifically, if you look, you can see on screen that we're going to be talking about the Jewish tradition specifically. Where do these parables come from? It wasn't a novel idea for Jesus to speak in parables. I know a lot of us, we read the Gospels and also reading the Old Testament of Tanakh, and you can think, well, where are these parables? Well, there are some parables that are in the Old Testament. You have Nathan confronting David. He tells him a parable. So there are parables that you can find in the Old Testament. But Jesus widely uses them when he's teaching and going around and serving. And it's a big part of his ministry that we'll talk about. Well, it wasn't a novel idea. It came from somewhere. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Jewish tradition and what that means even for Jesus. Okay, so we're going to hit the next slide here, and you'll be able to see my email. So make sure you reach out to me. If you have any questions, you want to, pick my brain on any type of topic, I can be able to get back to you and let you know about that. But make sure to jot that down. And for many of you who are part of the Slack, again, if you're visiting with us and you want to be part of the community and finding out more stuff that Impact Ministry does, again, whoever invited you, or even look at the links below, join our Slack. And that's kind of where we communicate a lot of our information and what's going on, and be a part of that. Be a part of our community. We welcome you into our community. And so, so make sure you do that again. Or if you feel like, I don't know if I'm ready for that, email me, questions, concerns, feedback, whatever. I'm all ears to be able to hear from it. Okay. So let's hop on in. Like I said, this is our second class. We're doing, Jewish traditions and how they connect to the parables of Jesus. Really, really excited stuff. But before we get all into that, I do want to do a quick recap of what we talked about so far. So last week, we went over a lot of material. And if you are visiting with us and you're like, or not even visiting with us, but maybe you didn't go to last class, remember a part of GPCC, but you didn't go to last class and you want to get that information, then again, make sure to email me, or if you're part of Slack, you can look in there. It's in the general channel. But the easiest way you can contact me. I also have links in the description, but the video necessarily won't be in there. We do have access to video. Again, you can email me for that stuff. But as far as the PDF and the different slides and notes, that's all in the description too as well for you to take. Again, so you have my email, so you can get caught up, but I'm gonna do a quick recap. It's not gonna cover everything that we talked about. So you want to go back and look at the slides and look at the PDF. And if you can, watch the video to catch up and be caught up to speed of what we're doing. Okay. So what did we talk about last week? So we talked about a couple of areas last week that we went through. We talked about the introduction to the parables and all that entails the introduction, and knowing that, these are stories that take us places, stories that transport us out of our reality into the storyteller's reality. These are places, typically we can't go in real life, when we're talking about these parables. Now, that's not all parables. I'm talking more of the storytelling form. It transports us into a different reality. But the parables that Jesus talks about, they're based and grounded in real things, even though the events that are laid out may not be real. And so I don't want to get confused in that way. But when we hear these stories, just in general, stories have the power to transport us. And that's a connection to parables, because parables are simply stories to teach us and to inform us. And they go a lot deeper than that. Again, go to that first class, explain a lot more in detail. Next, we talked about in the introduction as well, is that the storyteller has control over kind of what we see in the story, and shape our perspective and angles as they're giving their message. And we can't easily evade that. We can't, break out of what the storyteller is trying to convey to us. In order to get the story, we have to set aside our own preconceived notions and judgments and all of that in order to hear what the storyteller is telling us. And so that's the power of parables. And we'll kind of get a little bit of that later. They have so much power or the storyteller has so much power in that we're all along for the ride. And so you can see why Jesus used the parables and having that captive audience and having them on the edge of their seats as he was telling these parables that really had a big surprise at the end. There was things that the audience wasn't expecting, and it kind of jumped on them as Jesus had different punchlines strategically placed in order to teach about God's kingdom and what his kingdom is about versus where they were currently in their lives. And so all that's really, really good. We also talked about the common problem. One of the common problems with the parables is, in terms of people when they read them, is interpreting from the reader's and audience perspective versus the storyteller's perspective. And what I taught about that in short is that we can approach the parables and transport those stories into our reality versus us being transported into the storyteller's reality. That's a huge difference. When we shove in these parables into our own context, we're form fitting them into something that it's not meant to be. The parables that Jesus talked about was for that audience in that time. Now, there's a lot I can learn from it. It's not like I can't, that's not for me, then I got to skip it. No, there's a lot I can learn from it. But in order to get what he's saying and the full weight of what he's saying, I've got to take myself and transport myself there. So don't have that common problem there. And then we talked about what is a parable and the inner workings with that. And, we talked about meaning and significance and the power of meaning and significance. That meaning is, what was the intended meaning of the storyteller? What was his point, his or her point to the story? And the significance is, what does it mean to me? And so those competing thoughts are at odds with each other. And if we're going to interpret the parables the way Jesus taught them, we've got to take his meaning and ask the question, what does he intend when I read this? What is he getting at? What is he pointing to versus what do I get out of this? And how do I feel about this right now? And I kind of gave some great illustrations of me watching certain movies at different periods of my life and how it affected me then, but it affected me differently later in life because things have changed. And we're like that. We're creatures that are constantly changing, and life around us is constantly changing. And so it's really hard to transport the parable's context into our own lives because it's always shifting. Rather, we need to take the time and effort to bring ourselves there, if that makes any sense. And then we talked about what is a parable, and went through a couple of things about that. What is a parable? We talked about parables are a form of indirect communication intended to deceive the hearer into truth. And it sounds like a weird statement. Again, go back to first class to be able to get that. But I love the way that is phrased, because the parables really, they do that. Like you go in thinking one thing, especially in Jesus' time. You had all walks of life in terms of people who are different working professions, different levels of spiritual knowledge. And so you would have people eager to hear. And then you had people who are on the elitist side of things of religion. They're coming in there thinking they're hearing a story, and a mic drop, Jesus is completely throwing shade at them, right? And so they're coming out like, whoa, he's talking about us. And it dawns on them the realization of how savage Jesus could be when he's in these parables, directing things at the religious. And so it's one of those things where it is a kind of deceiving the hearer into truth, where they're kind of along for the ride until the punchline hits. So it's pretty incredible when you really get to see it jump off the page in scriptures. We talked about how rabbis spoke in parables for people to handle the understanding of the Torah. Like I said, it wasn't a novel idea that Jesus came up with. This is something the rabbis were doing long before Jesus was born, right? I mean, obviously, in a theological sense, he's always existed, but in terms of him being on earth and being able to interact on earth. So there's just a lot there that we have went through, and a couple other things. We talked about why the parables, and the biggest thing is indirect communication is very powerful. The parables are used by those who are trying to get God's people to stop, reconsider their ways, and to change their behavior. It's really powerful to hear a story and it gets you to stop in your tracks, right? And for us, what it'd be compared to is a sermon on a Sunday. That's a long form parable, right? It's coming from scriptures, but usually there's a story aspect to it. There's a title, there's probably 3 points, and then a conclusion, right? There's some sort of narrative that's going on when we're speaking, even though the scriptures are involved. Most notably that I talked about is our modern day parables are movies. And movies definitely move us in many ways. And I shared watching Finding Neverland and how that movie made me cry like a baby. There were so many things that connected with me that I wasn't even aware of. I didn't walk into the movie thinking, I want to cry like a baby when I walk out of this movie. No, I didn't know. I thought, hey, it's a great movie. Johnny Depp's going to be in it. I heard it was really good. Possible Oscar nomination. And I went in there and just completely just bawling, right? It hit me in certain ways that just really connected with me. Parables do that. They're able to get in there, and that indirect communication is very, very powerful. We talked about also parables are usually parables usually engage listeners, create reflection, and promote action. And that, I love that statement. It is one of the scholars had mentioned it. Like this is the prime motive of these parables, and you see why Jesus wanted to speak in parables. And so we'll get into that as we talk about the origin of those parables. Okay, so those are kind of things. Quick recap. That was very short of what we talked about. That class, I think, went for like 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. So please go back and look at the notes. And if you can, watch the video to really help you bring you up to speed. So let's get into what we're going to talk about tonight. So the parables of Jesus. This second session is going to be talking about Jewish tradition. Okay, so let's talk about that. Parable origins. Where do they come from? Where are they stemmed from? There's a lot to talk about in this area when we're talking about the origins of the parables. We see that, the reality is that God is revealed in word pictures of parables. And I want to talk about this a little bit because this is, and it's right there. It's one of the books that I'm going through. I'll make sure to put that in the notes. Very extensive book by Dr. Young, who is a Jewish scholar as well as a New Testament scholar. And this is a quote that stuck out to me when he says, like, man, the reality is that God is revealed in word pictures of a parable. And that's so true. And even that term, word pictures, you're going to hear me talk about that a lot tonight. And again, which harkens to what I just mentioned, our modern day parables are movies, which are word pictures in a sense, moving pictures, right? Not so much word, but more on screen, moving images. But that's what the parables were, these incredible word pictures that captivated people's minds. You know, the rabbis of old taught about God by using concrete illustrations that reach the heart through imagination. And I'm going to read that again. You know, rabbis of old taught about God by using concrete illustrations that reached the heart through imagination. And that's just like, that's exactly what parables do, right? That's exactly what they're geared to. And again, that deceptive way of working and getting in there and coming in, like sneaking up on you. But also like, man, like getting that illustration that gets to the heart of the matter and pulls in your imagination. It doesn't have to be all elaborate and fantasy driven. But you see when Jesus talks about his parables, when we get to that in the next class, where he's just talking about everyday life, but the way he sets up his characters and the stories within those parables, they're captivating. And people are on the edge of their seats waiting to see what's going to happen next. And so very, very, very powerful. You know, a quote that I want to read from a Jewish scholar says, when talking about the parable, it says it challenges the mind on the highest intellectual level by using simple stories that made common sense out of the complexities of religious faith and human experience. On the other hand, in finite terms, God is beyond human comprehension. But on the other, his infinite majesty may be captured in the vivid stories of daily life. And it's just a great quote. And that's what it is. It's like they're challenging you on the highest level. And these are the most simplest stories. When you read them, it's like, okay, you know, guy wants an inheritance, leaves dad, goes away, blows his money. He's got to come back. End of story, right? Very simple. But man, when you start to peel away the different layers and all of the social commentary that Jesus is making of that day, it's like, wow. He is handling so many of the dynamics of how Jews felt about outsiders in that particular parable I'm referring to, of the two sons, and how that interworking works, and how the Jews felt elitist, and how they were the older son. I mean, there's so much that Jesus is working in when he's talking about it is just simply fantastic. And so, you know, it's so true when you look at that quote. It's so true when you really think about it. Like the parables we can come across in the Gospels are just simply everyday life. Again, but the reality, they're literary icebergs that are shipwrecking unsuspecting hearers or the audience, right? That on face value, like an iceberg, doesn't look all that. Yeah, it looks, hey, it's just you know, small glacier, but beneath it, it's just a huge mountain of ice, right? It's so much deeper than you can really think or imagine. And that's what the parables really do. And that's what Jesus does. Okay, so look on screen here. We're going to read Matthew 21 through 45 through 46. Again, Matthew 21, 45 through 46, the NLT. It says, when the leading priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was telling the story against them, and they were wicked farmers. They wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds who considered Jesus to be a prophet. And the reason why I read this is just like I mentioned, they're literary icebergs. Like these religious people, the leading priests and the Pharisees, walked into this discussion not thinking they were going to be offended. Okay, because if they were, then they wouldn't be there. They walk into the discussion And Jesus in his parables telling us elaborate parable. If you go back and read the verses before, he's just talking about coming out of this parable, and it dawns on them as he gets to the end of this parable. Again, it's that literary iceberg. They just boom get shipwrecked. They're like, he is talking about us. He's putting us on blast. And that's exactly what he was doing. But that's the power of these parables. It's the power and the fact that these parables can have. I mean, just crazy, right? So where did this all start? Where does this all begin? Well, we look back at the word, the comparable word for parable in the Old Testament, which is mashal, and which has a wide-ranging list of meanings. But over time, the word has been stretched. The basic form of the word has been stretched to basically be to cover any type of illustration, any type of metaphor, if you will. And so, in a sense, the way that looking at the different books and definition that I saw, that I thought, man, this is really cool, kind of encapsulates that. It says that mashal defines the unknown by using what is known. And that's exactly, not completely exactly, but close to it in what we see in the Greek form of parable, which is to be cast alongside, right? As a comparison, showing one side to compare to the other. Even though, again, last week I talked about there's a lot of deeper levels to that, but mashal is the same thing. It's defining the unknown by what is known, taking the familiar of what people understand to help define that unknown. Again, but much deeper than once we dig into it. That's kind of the surface level. One scholar put it, mashal begins where the listener is, but then pushes them beyond into the new realm of discovery. I love that quote. I'll read it again. Mashal begins where the listener is, but then pushes beyond into the new realm of discovery. And that's the deeper part of it, right? Revealing the unknown, but more so like it's really, again, transporting someone and getting them to see beyond themselves and having a new epiphany, a new revelation, a new discovery. Again, very similar to the Old Testament view of the parables. Okay, Jewish teachers seem to have developed the classic form of the parable from their religious heritage and culture. And basically that, rabbis of old come to develop that through the way they would describe God. And we're going to get into that. Like the method of teaching was developed first. So, and if you know, again, just reading the Old Testament, the method of teaching is with word pictures. And you see, again, even the whole idea of Passover is telling a parable. I mean, obviously it really happened, but you're going in the story form to reenact, right, with word pictures and to describe. And that's so much that you get out of the New Testament, or not New Testament, but the Old Testament, is these word pictures, scriptures or prophecy describing God or describing events in a way that are very tangible for people, that they can really see it. And we get evidence of that and just how an Eastern versus Western way of describing God. And a Western way is very straightforward, very literal. God is mighty, God is faithful, God is powerful, right? Not that, Westerners can't be as descriptive, but that's the way we think. Easterners, very poetic, very visual, and to give an example, God is a fortress, right? That alone explains so much. It explains mighty, it explains faithful, it explains powerful, right? All in one phrase. God is a fortress, right? When I think of a fortress, I think of this mighty stronghold, right? I think of something that's faithful, that's sturdy, that's not going to be easily knocked down, and very powerful, very awe-inspiring, If you see like these old architectures of cathedrals in Europe, right? Took a art history class, and we just got a chance to see these like magnificent structures, awe-inspiring structures, right? But just picture that God is a fortress. It says it all, and that's how the rabbis would think. That's how really God's people would think in these word pictures to describe who God is. And just to help inform you, I have a list of scriptures here that I want to go through, just talking about just that. Again, where do the parables come from? Again, double backing on this point, where do the parables come from? You can see the evolution in this by just how God's people talk, how the teachers described who God was, how everything, like we talked about, I believe last week, and even in prior some classes that I taught, that the Bible largely is in narrative form. It's in a storytelling form. And so it's all built for this. And so it would just naturally come from that the rabbis would then tell their stories to connect with Bible truth. And you see that all over the Bible. It's plastered all over the Bible. And I'm going to read a couple of scriptures here for you. Psalm 59, verse 9. All these are on screen for you. So you don't have to sporadically go to your Bible. But again, if you want to, like I said, to test you to go in there, do it. But Psalm 59, verse 9, and this is the NIV, says, "You are my strength. I watch for you. You, God, are my fortress." Right there it is. Psalm, and a lot of these are in the Psalms, but though they're in different places. Psalm 93:1. Psalm 93 is one of my favorite Psalms, the chapters. But Psalm 93:1. "The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armed with strength. Indeed, the world is established firm and secure." Again, you see that imagery, the Lord being robed in majesty. It says a lot. It says that he is the mighty of mighties. Who wore robes? Kings, right? God strutting in his robe in majesty. It gives you the picture of what type of God is. 2 Samuel 22:29 says, "You, Lord, are my lamp. The Lord turns my darkness into light." Again, word pictures, right? These are many forms of kind of the evolutionary parable, right? It's these word pictures that ends up driving these bigger, longer story forms. And so you see this right here. I mean, of being pictured, the Lord is a lamp, right? You go from fortress to robed in majesty to a lamp. Like wow, like you see, again, and that says it all. If God's a lamp, he is navigating my way versus praying, "God leads me," right? Which is true. And if you pray that, don't feel guilty as you pray it. But man, praying that God is my lighthouse, right? God is my spotlight. God is a beacon from outer space, right? I mean, whatever. I mean, I don't pray that, but you can see what I'm talking about is these word pictures have so much more, at least in my opinion, weight, and it gets your mind thinking about, wow, I'm picturing God guiding my path in this dark world. It just says so much is packed in there. Psalm 98, verse 1. "Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him." I mean, do we know that God has arms? I don't know if we know that, right? I don't know, how his arm works, how his hands work, if he has hands like mine or arms like mine. But again, here you have the writer picturing these word pictures of seeing God doing marvelous things with what arm? Not his left, but his right. Right. And in that culture, the right arm was the strong arm, right? Majority of people were right-handed. If you were left-handed, it was a sign of weakness. So seeing God doing marvelous things with his right arm is like it's strength upon strength. And you're communicating that versus saying God is mighty. It just goes further to give you, again, those word pictures. And last one we're going to read is Exodus 15:3, which I love. One of my favorite scriptures here. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. I love it. That scripture is gangsta. But you get to see it's like, the Lord is a warrior. That says everything you need to know. The Lord is a warrior, right? Versus the Lord protects me. The Lord fights, right? It's like the Lord is a warrior. And wherever your concept or picturing a warrior, it says it all to communicate, especially for those in that time. The Eastern mind tended to conceive God in dynamic metaphors. God is known through his mighty acts. And that's how they were describing him. This type of language is appropriate for the later rabbinic mashalism, the parables, right? So this will be the language that again will evolve into the mashal and in the Hebrew word, parable in the Greek word. And so you can see where this is where they come from, right? They didn't come out of nowhere. It's the train of thought is already there in the scriptures. The way people thought about God, the way people thought about life in these word pictures, you can see where that evolution would come from. Parables use rich imagery of language to catch the listener unaware. Again, like we said, sneak up on you deceptively. In the creative genius of the parable, teacher's imagination, the listener is catching a glimpse of the divine character of God. It's awesome, right? I read that again. In the creative genius of the parable's teacher's imagination, the listener is catching glimpses of the divine character of God. Through comparative word pictures and language, they teach the listener about the divine character, showing what God is like and who God is. This is the power when you start using this type of words and where they would go in terms of being or turning into a parable. And you see these different comparisons both in Old Testament and the New Testament. New Testament, you can see God portrayed as a generous householder or a landlord or a housewife sweeping and trying to get coins, or a shepherd who's looking for sheep, a compassionate father who's going out to get his son, or a loving hen gathering her chicks. Like, God is, that language, those word pictures are used in comparing, having this comparison, much like the Greek form of parable alongside, describing who God is. Super, super incredible. Okay, so let's continue on. So this next part I want to talk about are parables as Haggadah. And I'll explain what that means. We understand and we see the evolution of where parables are coming from. Where did they come from? And we can see that and how the rabbis of old will take that language and then pull that into more long story form, explaining biblical truths and helping people. Again, we talked about last class session to handle the Torah, right? With these stories, they're able to handle and understand the Torah. The Haggadah is kind of where people believe this is exactly directly where they come from. Because over time, you get the Haggadah, and we're going to talk about what the Haggadah is. So turn over to Exodus, or again, it'll be on a screen here, but you can turn over it with your own versions. I'm going to read the NLT, and we're going to talk about kind of this scripture is the proof text for just the creation of the Haggadah. And Exodus 13, we're going to pick up in verse 3. It says, "So Moses said to the people, 'This is the day to remember forever, the day you left Egypt, the place of your slavery. Today the Lord has brought you out by the power of his mighty hand.'" Again, that language, right? Mighty hand. "Remember, eat no food containing yeast. On this day in early spring, on the mouth of Abib, you've been set free. You must celebrate this event in this month each year. And after the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. He swore to your ancestors that he would give you this land flowing with milk and honey. For 7 days, the bread you eat and be without the bread you eat must be made without yeast. And then on the 7th day, celebrate the feast of the Lord. Eat the bread without yeast during those 7 days. In fact, there must be no yeast bread or any yeast found within the borders of your land during this time. On the seventh day, you must explain to your children, I am celebrating what the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. And that's where the Haggadah comes from. We'll talk about exactly what that means. In verse 9, this is your annual feast. Verse 9. This is your annual festival that will be visible sign to you and mark and brand it on your hand and on your forehead. Let it remind you always to recite this teaching to the Lord with a strong hand, and the Lord rescued you from Egypt. So observe the decree of this festival at the appointed time each year. So what's cool about this and why this explains what Haggadah means is that this is basically where the God's people remember to recite what happened in Egypt. And when they're talking about the Passover, going back to that and what that meant and reciting that story. So what the Haggadah is a collection, is a Jewish text that's collecting over time that amplifies or elaborates on the biblical narratives and the teaching, like the Passover. And so, in fact, they would pull out the Haggadah during the Passover, during the Seder, and they will sit and read these stories, i.e. parables, about different events, connecting, helping, illuminating, surrounding those times. Similar to like a sermon like I shared before. Again, I didn't have movies, but more like a sermon or a talk, or Bible talk, so to speak. But this is really cool. Like you're like, that's a parable. That's exactly what a parable is. And they believe that this from the word pictures to the Haggadah, boom, you get the parables and where they're drawn from. Not in the word parable, but where the Marshal from from word pictures to the Haggadah to Marshal until New Testament when you get the parables. But this is really cool to see this. Like wow, and again, reading this and studying this up, I'm like, wow, I wasn't even familiar with the Haggadah. And here it is. It's a whole Jewish text devoted to parables, devoted to stories and narrative, storytelling to help teach the Bible. It's like, well, wow, that totally makes sense of why the rabbis would be using this and why Jesus picks it up, right? And why this is floating around the culture of the time. It's just really, really cool to see that incredible connection. And we'll get into a little bit about what more of what the Haggadah is in detail here. You can look at the next slide. Okay, so here in this next slide, we see the term Haggadah comes from the Hebrew word that is to show or to tell. Again, and that's in order to fulfill Exodus 13:8 we just read in terms of sharing that story. In verse 8 that it reads, it says, on the seventh day you must explain to your children that I am celebrating what the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. That's where you get that term Haggadah from, to show or to tell, telling these stories passed down, handed down, so that people don't forget the Passover. It's just incredible that God will use that way of teaching, right? I mean, God himself is telling the people to talk to them in parables, right? Now, Passover really happened. It's not a story made up, but it is through storytelling form that it's handed down. I mean, it's crazy. Again, you can see the power of this, the power the stories have on our lives. I mean, it's right there. There's some other stuff that I want to share about Haggadah. It also talks about that, among the two types of interpretation, Haggadah is the more popular, having a wider appeal. Now, there's other Jewish texts, and you have the Halakha within the Mishnah, and you have the Haggadah. Halakha is more of the rules, right? And that's more of the letter of the law. People stick by it. People know that you don't elaborate. You don't go outside the bounds. You stick to exactly what it says. The other side of it is the Haggadah, which it's like, no, this is that poetic side. This is that side to take and elaborate on the Bible story. Take to tell stories to help you connect with the Bible story. And so became the more popular text, and having that wider appeal. Its way of storytelling is designed to touch the human heart so that one should recognize him who created the world, and so to cling to his ways. Crazy, right? Like that was said, I think by one of the rabbis, and I have it in the notes, the exact quote and where it's from. But that's crazy. Like that's a parable, people. I mean, you could see it. It's like right there. Like you could see where Marshall comes, and then again in the New Testament, the parable. As one Jewish scholar said, its purpose is to bring heaven down to earth and to elevate man to heaven. We just talked about what parables do, or even before that, to open up early on in the lesson, we talked about what Marshall is, right? It's this connection. It's revealing the unknown by what is known. And this is exactly what it's saying. You're bringing heaven down and you're transporting and elevating, mankind up. Just really, just an awesome quote. There's a couple more things of Haggadah here before we move on and get ready to end. Again, put your questions in the chat. Hopefully this is, making sense. I know it's a lot of information, but again, I have the notes for all of you to be able to go down as well, go down and look at it as well as the slides. Okay, here's some more stuff about Haggadah. It says, in particular, as imaginative interpretation, Haggadah is driven by the search for God and practically every word and every syllable. That's the power. Even what we talked about in the last class, that's the power of the storytelling parable form, is that when you share in that way, the story is captivating and it's easy to conceptualize and understand, versus reading a bunch of rules that you really get behind it and actually memorize. When you grasp the story, you grasp every part of it. It's real. It becomes tactile, right? And it's in this weird way that you're living in it. And again, I love that quote where it talks about Haggadah. It's just driven by the search for God and in practically every word and every syllable. And Jesus does that in the parables. When we dive into the parables, when we look at and break them down, everything is intended. Now, not every word. I think people can, and we talked about this the other day, the problem diving in and trying to tear apart every little thing about the parable and put it in our own context. Don't do that. But Jesus he has an intent. There's stories with intent. This is what he wants to, how he wants to tell the story. This is the audience he wants to tell it in front of, and this is how he wants to tell it and the time frame he wants to tell it. And every aspect of that has significance, because again, it's pointing back to a greater truth that he's trying to get people to see about God's kingdom. And so every word, every syllable has significance. Moreover, the playful nature of the Haggadah has a religious quality missed by those with too narrow of a definition, which, of what comprises theological reflection. I love this because, you get a part of this is where when Jesus talks about, he speaks in parables, and those seeing, they do not see. People may say, oh, these childish stories. No, they're not. Even though just because someone can have a certain playful nature, they're very deep, and they're digging very deep of what Jesus in the New Testament is talking about God's kingdom. And in the Old Testament, what the rabbis are pointing towards, the scriptures of the Torah and how we should hold to the Torah. I mean, this is very important stuff. And it may not, again, be this 50-page paper on theology, but they're jam-packed with real connections that can help unlock truth and send you on an adventure of finding and digging deeper in your Bible. I would argue just as deep, just a different way, but just as deep. And that's why I love the parables. Love them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more before I want to actually read a parable from the Haggadah here. Okay, let's drop down here. Regarding the purpose of the Haggadah, rabbis teach us that if you desire to know him who spoke the world and came into being, then study the Haggadah. From this study, you'll know him who spoke the world into being, and you will cleave to his ways. Wow, right? I mean, it's right in line of what Jesus was talking about. That though you're seeing, you won't see, and though you're hearing, you won't hear. What the Haggadah, what the rabbis is pushing the Haggadah would do is the same that Jesus was pushing the parables would do. Call you to a decision. If you want to know God and you desire to know him deeper way, read the Haggadah. If you don't, then don't, right? If you want to understand the greater aspect of God and his kingdom, then you need to really figure out what these parables are about. If you don't see it, then you're not trying hard enough. Like, it's pretty simple. And again, you can see where those parallels are. Okay, let's look at an example of a parable in the Haggadah. And here's, again, a great example from Rabbi Eleazar's encounter with an exceedingly ugly man. This is called the Rabbi and the Exceedingly Ugly Man. Pretty obvious. So be here on the slide. So on one occasion, Rabbi Eleazar and his son of Rabbi Simeon, was coming from Migdal Geder, from the house of his teacher. He was riding leisurely on a donkey by the riverside and was feeling happy and elated because he had studied much Torah. There he chanced to meet an exceedingly ugly man who greeted him. "Peace be upon you, Rabbi." He, however, did not return his greeting, but instead said to him, "Raka," empty one, or good for nothing. "How ugly you are! Is everyone in your town as ugly as you are?" The man replied, "I do not know. But go and tell the craftsman who made me, how ugly is the vessel which you have." When Rabbi Eleazar realized that he had sinned, he dismounted from his donkey and he prostrated himself before the man and said to him, "I submit myself to you. Forgive me." Wow, right? Here you have the rabbi of prominence who's traveling through a city, and he sees this exceedingly ugly man. He looks at the man. He tells him, "You're exceedingly ugly," it's pretty savage. I mean, you get for a rabbi to say that. Imagine me, walking down the street and looking at someone who, in my opinion, is not attractive, and I tell that person, "You're exceedingly ugly." How offensive is that, right? But this guy had the best comeback one-liner. He's like, I don't know if everyone in my town is this ugly. I know we're all jacked up, but you know what? Can you go tell the Creator who made me that he made me jacked up? I mean, it's just like, what do you say to that? What do you say to that? But get off your horse, get on your knees, and, be humbled, right? He was immediately humbled. But this is a form of a parable in the Haggadah, which is really cool. And when you look at it again, breaks down, has all these different insights of how, the rabbi couldn't hold his tongue as he encountered this man who, in his opinion, was unattractive. And it talks about that the parable is pushing that everyone in God's eyes is his creation. And our opinions of and our values of what beauty is and what beauty isn't, who cares? God created everything that we see. He's created, every person that we have. And maybe they don't fit the look that our society tells us. It doesn't take away that God created them. And so just a great, powerful parable. And again, no crazy study in theology, but just a simple parable that just packs a punch. And for the character in the parable, but even for us, it's very humbling to me. How many times have judged people? How many times have you been prejudiced towards somebody or judged them from afar by how someone walks or eats or what they drive or their intelligence, right? Wow, how convicting, for the past judgment on that. And for, again, if we were to actually say the thoughts that are in our heads, and for that person to turn around, it's well, then tell your God that you worship why did he make me this way? Right? I mean, it's very, very convicting. That's the power, again, of the parables. And that's one specifically in the Haggadah. Again, this particular parable reaches the heart and challenges the mind, like we had mentioned before, just about the power of parables. It inspires people to see God's image versus our expectation of what humans should look like. Again, all this is packed in to that one parable. Okay, so as we end here, and I know we went a little long, and again, put your questions in the chat, but as we end here, it leads up to now where we get to really get to dive into looking at the different inner workings of the different parables. But as we end, the last point I want to make is we talked about the origin of the parables. We talked about the parable really in the connection it has with the Haggadah. And now we're going to talk about the parables as gospel. And from all that, you can see from the origins of the word pictures, from seeing the power of the effect that the Haggadah had, not that it was ranking over the Halakha or the rule book text, but the fact that it drew people in, and the fact that people read the Haggadah during Passover, one of the central events in Judaism. Like there is no Judaism without Passover, right? Like it's everything. It's everything. It's like the cross for Christians. Like it's without the cross, there is no Christianity. And so here you have in the most important celebration, most important event, you have them reading the Haggadah, right? You have them breaking it out and talking about these stories. You have God himself in Exodus 13 pushing onto the people, hey, you need to pass these stories on. So then when we get to the gospel, you can see why Jesus was pushing the parables from what I just explained. You can see why Jesus was so adamant about teaching in parables and this desire to speak in parables. And like I mentioned before, I think it was last class or may have been one of the classes I taught, but 1/3 of the recorded sayings of Jesus in the synoptic gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are parables. That's crazy. 1/3 of what he said strictly are parables. Just parables. Parables were very important to him. And from learning about the Haggadah, you can see why Jesus chose this method. Turn over, or actually be on the screen, Matthew 13, 34 through 35. And I love this verse because it speaks to what we just said. Matthew 13, 34, 35. It says, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Crazy. All that's jam-packed, right? He's speaking to them only in parables, showing the emphasis and importance of the parable. And in 35, he actually defines it as what we talked about, taking the unknown and making it known. Taking the unknown and sharing what's known. He says, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world, in hopes that people would understand. But those who are not committed to it, they won't understand. The gospel is very clear that Jesus is making is that he is going to use parables as a teaching method to teach about God's kingdom. And if he is that serious about it, then we need to be that serious about studying them. We need to be that serious about figuring out its truths and really holding these parables really close to us and understanding the effect that they have and what God is trying to communicate through them. It's very, very, very important. And so I hope that as we went through this, I know long-winded, but I hope you get what Jesus you get where Jesus is coming from and why the parables are so important. Again, going all the way back as we looked about rabbis of old, and even beyond that, as we look at how the Torah is written in these word pictures. And from those word pictures, we can get these stories in the Haggadah that really become the mashals, again, parables of in the Hebrew word, a mashal, that end up becoming parables in the New Testament. You can see where that's all going. In the next class we talked about, we're going to finally jump into the parables, right? We got enough backstory, and hopefully that's helped you understand the importance of it. And now we can jump right in and get into those parables. Okay, so as we conclude, parables, we talked about the origin and the vivid language, the word pictures that come from the Tanakh, the Old Testament. They're rooted in the Haggadah and its effect and its just amazing impact that it has had on God's people and still have on God's people with its stories and connections and allusions and the story of the that we just read about the exceedingly ugly man and the impact that they could have. And then lastly, just for us to see the importance of why Jesus specifically wanted to express his teachings this way. I think for us, we need to take note of that. For us, it should be important to us as well. Not that you're like, well, parables is kind of cool, but you're just like, wow, this is really important. Like Jesus specifically chose this method to preach a good portion of his ministry. And a lot of it can go back on, parts of its training and kind of see kind of day-to-day stuff, but a bulk of his teaching was in parable form. So hopefully that helps, and it was great, and you got a lot of it. I have homework for you, so don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. So there's some homework that I want to give to you. Okay. So as we conclude, it's just amazing to see that we got to see the origin of where the parables come from in these word pictures and vivid language of the Tanakh and the Old Testament, that they're rooted in the Haggadah and the same stories and these incredible allusions is what the rabbis believe to pick up and tell their own parables and teachings to get people to handle the Torah. And then you can see why Jesus heavily expressed using these parables because of the history and the backdrop and the rich layers of just rabbis before them, and then the scriptures of using this type of method to really teach and inspire people and call them to a decision. So hopefully you got to see that and it made sense. I know it was a lot. Hopefully it made sense. Go back and look over it. And I'm excited. It's awesome. And that was it. What I want to do is I have some homework for you, so don't leave. Here's some homework. I want for you to write your own psalm, okay? I want for you to use word pictures. I want for you to use vivid language. And I want for you to make your own psalm. So take some time and to sit down. I think at least write, we'll say 10 verses. And then it could be more as long as you want, but at least 10 verses and write with language like, God is your fortress, God is your right hand, God gathers you like a hen with chicks, right? Things that we talked about. I want for you to write your own psalm with your own word pictures and vivid language and see how easy it is to do that or how hard it is. And then when we come back in a couple of weeks, what I want to do is I want for us to share them, okay? And somehow we'll figure that out where I'll reach out to you guys and maybe you can email me and I can read them on the next live stream. But I want for us to be able to share them, okay? So with that, we'll close out with a word of prayer. Thank you for being here tonight. Again, if you're visiting with us, again, make sure to make that known in the chat. And I hope you come back and stick around. And for those who are members, it's just great to be with you guys. I know can't have a whole lot of interaction, but I'm always encouraged by our ministry. And I love you guys a lot. So let's close out with a prayer and we'll be done. Let's go to God. Father, I thank you for this time. Father, please just bless our Bible study. Bless us to be deep and to get deep in our Bible study, for you to guide our hands through this whole process. Father, I pray that as we can take up the homework and write our own psalms, God, that we can be just bowled over by how awesome you are. And this is a time for us to be poetic and to share our love and awe and respect of you. God, thank you so much for who you are. Thank you so much for being our God. And you are our fortress in a time of this COVID, God. You are our refuge, God. You are the vaccine, Father, for our lives, the antidote, God, that we need to survive, Father. I pray that we see that. I pray that we strive for that. God, thank you so much for this time. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.